The first thing I'm going to start with is a very, very interesting thing. But I did not see this myself. It was repeated to me by somebody whom I trust very much. In other words, what I'm about to tell you says, although I didn't see it. About 13 years ago, 14 years ago, the Beis Mashiach magazine printed tons of letters from the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbe Tzemach Medina. The Frierdiker was in America, the Rebbe Tzemach Medina was in Latvia. The Rebbe wrote her every single day in Yiddish. These letters, in effect, constitute his diary. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that from the time he was, I think 11, maybe earlier, he kept a journal every single day of his life, and he never missed a day. Of course, besides for Shabbat and Yom Tov, to write in his journal. Much or most of this diary is unfortunately lost. There's a letter from the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbe where he tells the Rebbe, I wrote so much, where is it? Where are all my writings? We have bits and pieces of the Rebbe's diary in various forms. For example, the Rebbe used to have a tog book, a day book, a little folder that has and he used to write every day short notes. But apparently everything that he wrote in the tog book, in short, someplace else was written at length. This is a typical example. The Rebbe was in America. The Rebbe kept in a journal that he kept with him very short notes, but he would write letters to his wife, to the Rebbe Tzemach Medina, send them to her, and of course when he came back to Latvia, he collected those letters. These are his diary. And he's writing a lot to the Rebbe Tzemach Medina about America. And I want to share with you two ideas that the Rebbe mentions in this diary. Number one, the Frierdiker Rebbe writes to his wife, to his Rebbetzin, I came to a land where every single thing that they do with a big tumult. Everything they do, they have to show off. Everybody has to see what they're doing. Demonstrations. Stell sich vor, was an niedrige Menschen sie sind. That's the conclusion the Frierdiker Rebbe draws. Just imagine how lowly a people they must be if everything they do they have to show off. This is the first thing I want to show you. This is how the Frierdiker Rebbe assessed America in his first visit in 1929, 1930. Americans are, without a doubt, the most demonstrative people in history. Nobody has parades the way we do. I once heard from a man, America is the richest man in the country in the world, not because we make better machines, not because we have better technology or better scientists, but because we're better at selling things, at advertising, everything about America is demonstration. And the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, writes to his wife, a nation, a people, whose basic disposition is to show off, is lowly. This is the first thing I want to share. Number two, he writes to the Rebbetzin about the incredible assimilation of American Jewry, and how they're very sincere, but they're incredibly Americanized, and so on and so forth. And then he writes, quote, I think this I saw myself, but maybe not, unser Mendel, mit sein Wissenschaft, whatever, I forgot the last word. Our Mendel, with his knowledge, in other words, with his knowledge of Chochmah Chitzenius, will conquer America, will affect America. I have heard from people who are in the know, and I am not in the know, that after the Rebbe was in America, the Frierdiker came to America, his relationship with the Rebbe's studying in university changed. When he saw what American Jewry looked like, the Frierdiker understood what the Rebbe was thinking. When in quotes, the Rebbe got himself a secular education. And this is a quote from a letter. Unser Mendel mit sein Wissenschaft, our Mendel with his Wissenschaft will change America, will affect America. The Frierdiker Rebbe did not want to come to America. All of us know this. I've told it to you in a number of different opportunities and the learnings. The quote that I heard from my book at Alav Shalom, he was in Poland. He wasn't there when the statement was said, but he heard it very close to the time. So when the Rebbe visited America in 1929, 1930, American Jewry invited the Rebbe to settle in America. American Jew asked the Frierdiker Rebbe to live here. And they offered the Frierdiker Rebbe anything he wanted. Had the Rebbe lived in America, he would have had plenty of money. And the Rikir he would have had such better medical care. The Frierdiker Rebbe suffered with, he didn't have proper medicines, proper doctors, and he couldn't afford to pay for the medicines that he needed. Had the Rebbe lived in America, he would not have had any of these issues, but the Rebbe did not want to live in America. And the quote that I heard from my book was, quote, Ich will sein a Rebbe über Chsidim, ich will nicht ein Rebbe über der Welt. I want to be a Rebbe over Chassidim. I don't want to be a Rebbe over the whole world. I inherited the seat of Chabad from my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. All of them were first and foremost the Rebbe's Rebbe Chassidim. I want to be a Rebbe over Chassidim. He postponed coming to America until the war. We know now, based on documents, that as early as 1938, meaning to say way before the bombs landed on Warsaw and Lnadvotsk, which was September 1st, 1939, the Frierdiker Rebbe had put into act plans to move to America. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe began to make plans to leave the United States before the war started. Not necessarily connected to the war, but because he felt that the time was right to come to America. I don't know if you've ever seen the films of the Rebbe coming to America. The first time the Rebbe came to America, he walked off the ship like a prince. The second time he came to America, he was literally carried off the ship in a wheelchair. But there's another difference. When the Yidden in America saw the Frierdiker Rebbe, they didn't recognize him. He aged in those 10 years what a normal person ages in 30 or 40 years. The Frierdiker Rebbe came off the ship the second time, being carried in a wheelchair with his Shabbos clothes, wearing his shtreimel and his kapote and maybe even a garter. Frierdiker Rebbe was saving himself from the Nazis, coming to a new land in his big day Shabbos. Now, nobody ever told me why, but I believe that the Frierdiker Rebbe put on big day Shabbos because he was experiencing a Shabbos moment. His coming to America was strictly and entirely a shlichus. He was not coming here to save himself. He was not coming to think about himself. He was coming here to make America a mokum Torah while European walls, Rahman al-Islam, were burning to the ground. And he came off wearing the Shabbos to tell himself or to tell America there's nothing parochial, there's nothing ordinary about this event. This is entirely a Yiddishkeit event. And I just recently read, I forgot from whom, that when the Frierdiker Rebbe landed in America, he wasn't here 15 minutes and he was swinging both fists. The Rebbe came here with such a will. Mamish, before his first day was over, he shook the walls of America with will. I am going to make this country different. As soon as he landed here, he didn't give himself a chance to rest, to think, to breathe. He landed off that ship and he couldn't walk, but he was running to change America. Now there's a little piece of film which I found very interesting, and you can think whatever you want about me, yeah, because all this is a conjecture, it's an opinion, it's a heritage. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came here the first time, 29, Frierdiker Rebbe was tall, handsome, and looked healthy. I don't think he was very healthy, but he looked very healthy. He walked off the ship with a big hat, and two Irish policemen held him on both sides. In fact, there's a piece of footage. The Rebbe was walking, and one of the policemen put his hand on the Rebbe's chest, like, you wait till we tell you to go. And the Frierdiker Rebbe looks at his hand, and he thinks, and he nods, okay, in America have to behave. And these two policemen walked him off the ship. In some of the films, they edited out those few seconds, but if you saw the unedited, this guy put his hand on the Rebbe's chest, like, excuse me, you'll go when I tell you, kind of. The Rebbe looks at his hand and thinks for a second, and he goes, I struggle. And you watch him walking off the ship, and he's looking around like this. He's just looking. He's moving from side to side, he's looking. A Rebbe, when he comes to a new place, has to feel it out. We come to a new place, you have to protect yourself against the newness yoyness. A Rebbe comes to a new place, he has to feel it out. The Frierdiker came to America, he studied America. He wanted to understand American people. He wanted to understand American culture. He wanted American ways, American language, American mishigas. He wanted to know as much as he could about America. Because if he was going to be in America, and he was going to have an influence on America, he had to speak the language of the Americans. A year and a couple of months after the Frierdiker Rebbe came, the Rebbe came. There is no question that the Rebbe also, whether independently or together with the Frierdiker Rebbe, made it his job. The Rebbe came here. He made it his business to understand America, how America works, how politics works, how the social mediums work, how people relate to one another, what's considered normal, what's considered appropriate, inappropriate. If the Rebbeim were going to change this country, they needed to understand it. And there is no doubt, the Rebbeim have incredible minds, so it doesn't take them 100 years to figure it out, that they invested considerable time and effort in Pashut understanding the American culture. When they understood the American culture, they began to use every little bit of American culture to their purposes, including, and probably very close to the top of the list, the tendency of America to make what the Rebbe called Nesichis parades. If America is about noise, we're going to make Jewish noise. If America is about advertising, we're going to advertise Judaism. If America is about demonstration and showing off, we're going to demonstrate and we're going to show off and we're going to be proud and we're going to be Jewish. The Frierdiker Rebbe understood this, and the Rebbe understood this almost as soon as they arrived. And the Lubavitcher Hasidim who were around them were so embarrassed. Why? Because in America you showed off, but in America you showed off Americana. You showed off how Goyish you are, not how Yiddish you are. And the Rebbe said, what's the difference? America showing off. Everybody shows off. They're Mishagas. They have an Irish parade and a Caribbean parade and a Chvesin Vasvara parade. There's going to be a Jewish parade. As soon as the Rebbe got here, that idea was not only boiling in his mind, he immediately put it into action. The first story that we know of a parade is the story of Tashlich, which I'm sure you've heard, but you're going to hear it again. Recently, in the last couple of months, Zalman Poizner passed away. Zalman Poizner was the shliach of the Frierdiker Rebbe yet from 4950. He was a shliach to Nashville, Tennessee. He was, I think, Israeli born. I don't think he was born in Russia. Born in Israel, he came here as a little boy. His father moved to America in the late 20s. Zalman Poizner was very intelligent. He was a very smart person. Zalman Poizner also was very cultured. He was very proper. He was very well read. He was not a battler. He knew what was going on in the world. Zalman Poizner was a chassid, a shliach. Anyway, so this is the story that Zalman Poizner tells. The Frierdiker Rebbe moved into 770 a week before Rosh Hashanah Mamish, Tafshin Aleph, right? It says Chof Aleph Elul Tafshin, the 21st day in Elul, which is sometime in September 1940. The Frierdiker Rebbe came to 770. That Rosh Hashanah, our Rebbe was not in New York. He was in France. The following Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Beis, 1941, the Rebbe had been in America only for 4 months. He came at the end of Sivan. He came in the end of June, I suppose. Now it's September. Now, understand, Crown Heights was not a neighborhood with any Hasidim. When the Frierdiker Rebbe bought the building of 770, the block association of 770, which included our side of Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn and Kingston, and our side of Union Street, was a block association, signed a petition to prevent the Rebbe from buying the house. They didn't want European rabbis in their neighborhood who's going to bring down property prices, which he of course did. Now he's raised them up exponentially, but certainly the prices came down when they moved to the neighborhood. Do you know what that means? The Rebbe just came from Nazi Europe, and the Jews and the Goyim in that square block wanted to prevent the Rebbe from buying the house. He paid for it. He took a mortgage out against the building. They wouldn't let him buy it. The story was there was a doctor who lived next door to 770. They brought him the petition. After most people had signed it, many of them Jews, he read the petition. Before anybody could say boo, he said, on the other side of the ocean, they're killing our brothers. Here a rabbi wants to come and relocate to America, you're not going to let him settle? And he tore the petition into little tiny pieces. This doctor, who would later be disturbed by all the noise the Bacham were making, would poke his head out of his window and say, this is now the Rebbe's library. If not for me, you wouldn't be here. Be quiet. I don't know how much respect the Bacham gave him, but that's a true story. So 770 was not exactly, I don't know. 770 was not exactly inviting to Lubavitch. Nobody could afford to live in Crown Heights. All the Frume Yidden lived either in Williamsburg or East New York and Brownsville because they were cheap. Those were the Frum neighborhoods. Crown Heights was the Beverly Hills of Brooklyn. It was a very elite neighborhood. It's built on a hill. It's very beautiful. And the people who built these homes were all Jews. And the apartment buildings in those days were like the equivalent of today a condo. Chassidim used to come from all over Brooklyn to be by the Rebbe Yom Tov. Everybody was very behaved. They were very quiet and would disturb the peace. So the Rebbe shows up in 770. This is the second Rosh Hashanah after the Rebbe arrives. After the Frierdiker Rebbe arrives, but the first Rosh Hashanah the Rebbe arrives. And the Rebbe says, "Is there a Tashlich?" He says, "Sure." A mile from here is Botanical Gardens. We go to Botanical Gardens. There's a little pond with some fish with the Tashlich. Sure. When are we leaving? 5 o'clock. Okay, sure. Comes 5 o'clock. Then Amash, who was then 39 and a half years old, comes out of 770. It's about 80 men. That's how Rabbi Poizner describes it. They walk into Tashlich. And the Ramash says, Nita Zoygate. That's not how we go to Tashlich. Okay, how do we go to Tashlich? We gate Tzvei, march in pairs, like an army. Everybody take a partner, go in a line, pairs. Should look respectful. And then Rebbe geht a tracht, thinks for a moment. You should sing this song. Exactly what the doctor ordered. You should sing. Off and go. Rabbi Paltiel says the first miracle that Rebbe performed in America was, of these 80 men, not one said boo. The Rebbe said to gain tzvei tzvei, they went tzvei tzvei. The Rebbe said zingen anigen, they sang. Every window in Crown Heights. Yeah. Opened. All Jews. Both sides of Eastern Park, these big apartment buildings. In those days, those apartment buildings were occupied by very well-to-do people. All of them had been in temple that day. It's a Rosh Hashanah for them also. Remember, in 1940, most Jews, they may not have been frum, but they went to temple. They went to shul. They were very traditional. They all spoke Yiddish. Many of them was their first language. And the whole Crown Heights sees the 80 Michiganers marching from 770 to Tashlach. And the Rebbe, Chas v'Shalom, went back the same way. He went back with Union Street to disturb the peace on all the Jews living on Union Street. And the Rebbe never, by the way, went back the same way he came. He would always take a different route. There's mistama reasons, but tactfully the Rebbe did it because he wanted to bother as many Jewish people as possible. Zalman Posner was terribly uncomfortable. The Ramash said, so they did it, but he really said, I prayed. I said, next year, you got to get me out of this. And he said, I learned the power of prayer. Came the next year, Reb Shmuel approaches him, Reb Shmuel Levittin, and he says to Zalman, Reb Shmuel Levittin was then close to 60. He says to him, I can't walk. Reb Shmuel was also a very frume Yid. Tashlach took him probably 25 minutes to say. So he says to Zalman Posner, could we walk slower? Would you mind walking with me after the crowd? And Zalman Posner said, would I mind? I'm thrilled. I don't want to walk with those Michiganers. Anyway, they went to Tashlach. Reb Shmuel and Zalman Posner arrived in Tashlach when they were leaving already. Reb Shmuel's Tashlach probably took longer than anybody else's. So by the time they went back, it was 10-15 minutes later. And they followed everybody down Union Street, and there was still plenty of Jews milling around. They're walking back. A Yid walks up to them, a very, very well-dressed Jew with long hair, no yarmulke, and he grabs Zalman Posner by the collar. Why are they singing? Why are they singing? So Zalman Posner thinks to himself, I try to get out of trouble. I want to get out of the pan. I'm in the fire. So he starts to eke and beke, to stammer and to stutter. What's he going to tell him? Before he had the chance to answer him, this Yid still holding on to his collar says to him, you know why they're singing? I'll tell you why they're singing. He says, every Jew has a fire deep inside here. And sometimes that fire becomes very dormant. He says, when they walked by, and they were singing, I'm proud to be a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. That fire ignited and burst into flames. And he walks away. This is the first parade. Parades by the Rebbe was such a big deal. What Lubavitcher Hasidim of old would call chitzonius, what the Misnagdim call bittul Torah, what I just saw a paper sometime by the Satmar Hasidim in Borough Park. You shouldn't participate in it because ein ruach hachamim neiche imenu. I don't know which ruach hachamim is ein neiche. That the rabbis don't approve of the parades. By the Rebbe, it was so important. You know why? Because the Rebbe says America is a land of showing off. We're going to show off that we're Jewish. And you know what? If you have a little payalach and you go to Chayden, for you it's important to show off. Why? In the Heimat, das nicht getan. But you know what else? In the Heimat, nicht in andere Sachen. Every Jew in America needs to feel proud because America looks at us. And just looking at us, and you feel ashamed. When you're a boy of 6 in Williamsburg with Payalach, and you're a bus, and Freya kids your age look at you, you are embarrassed. I don't care how satma you are. And the Rebbe wants, not just for the Freya, especially for the Freya, he holds, in America, a Jew has to walk in the street and say, I'm Jewish, and I'm proud, eat your heart out. I'm going to wear my yarmulke, and my beard, and my payas, and my tzitzis in the street. Now today nobody thinks of it. But even when I was growing up, it was considered a chutzpah. I mean, the Jewish kids went to an amusement park. Only the Lubavitchers kept their tzitzis out. Everyone else put their tzitzis inside. You didn't want to dafka. So that, what's the strings? Hey, there's something hanging out of your pants. You know? The idea of a Jew being proud is so important. To the Rebbe, the parades is such a deep and holy thing, even though it's so totally chitzoniistic and American, because it holds a Jew. It keeps a Jew with a sense of Judaism. And again, parades is an invention of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Not Rabbi Hecht, das lang ist stark, not Rabbi Chadakov, not all the big shpitz. The parade was the Rebbe's own idea. Of course, the idea was developed, but the first parade and the subsequent parades, the very early years, it came directly from the Rebbe's mind, because it was so un-Jewish. It was so frei. Only the Rebbe could say, we're going to take this, and we're going to make it Kodesh Kadoshim. This is the story of the parade, if you want to go back to the very, very beginning of the story. One more story I want to tell you. This is an aside. It's not so nagea lenidun, but it's still nagea enough to mention. Years ago in Yeshiva, Rabbi Edelman came to Fabrein. Rabbi Edelman is the shlich of the Rebbe, I think, someplace in Connecticut. Rabbi Edelman has been a shlich of the Rebbe for 65 years. Massachusetts. What's his first name? 65 years, 60 years shlich forever. You see him a lot in Crown Heights now. And he told us some very interesting stories. And I actually had the seichel to write them down someplace. One of the stories that he told us was, the Frierdiker Rebbe came to New York in 1940. He had no money, he had no house, he had no friends, he had no nothing. And he asked questions about the Torah education in New York. And he discovered, as you all know the history, there were very few day schools. There were more yeshivas than day schools. That means to say, if you were still frum at 18, you had more of a chance of learning Torah than if you were 5 and wanted not to go to public school. There was no place. There were 3 or 4 schools for first graders, second graders. School for little kids at Kamat Negeven. There was Torah V'das. There was a yeshiva called Torah Tmim in those days. I believe there was the Tiferes Yerushalayim, which is now called the Yeshiva of Moshe Feinstein. And there was, maybe there was RJJ, I don't know how long it is. There was also one more yeshiva, Chaim B'Lev had a day school. There were very few day schools. Very few. And in all the day schools, they learned, kids came to school 9 o'clock in the morning and learned English. Why? The New York State Board of Education decided religious instruction in the afternoon when the kids are exhausted, the morning has to be fresh for the Limudei Chol. Why? They have to be good Americans. So the Frierdiker Rebbe called up each one of these schools and said, I am hiring a lawyer. I am taking the New York State Board of Education to court to get this law changed. The Jewish children are supposed to go to yeshiva in the morning and learn your Jewish instruction first. Will you join me? It's not going to cost you a penny. I'm paying all the bills. This is a Rebbe who was living in a hotel, you understand? He was living in a hotel in somebody else's dollar. Will you join me? So they said, of course we'll join you, but you're wasting your time. The Rebbe hired one of the top lawyers in the state of New York, paid a guzma mit Geld, was it nicht gehat? I have no idea, he didn't tell me. And he changed the law. He changed the law. Yiddish kinder in the handful of Chedalach that they were. And of course, as soon as the Rebbe arrived, he himself started a Talmud Torah. But you had what was called Temche Tmimim and Ache Tmimim and Bnei Tmimim. From mamish little kids should learn Torah, that they should learn Torah in the morning. One of the first things, it just gives you a sense of how the Rebbe was thinking when he came to this country. I'm sorry.
Were they changed as well?
The New York State Board of Education. I don't know the particulars. This is a story he told. Now, there were 2 ideas that need to be mentioned as an introduction to the parades. The first was Mesilas Shabbos. Understand, the America of those years had thousands of Jewish children, tens of thousands of Jewish children. There were public schools in a certain part of Brooklyn where the first language was Yiddish. They were learning Limudei Chol. There was nothing Jewish about the environment. 80, 90, 95, 97% of the children were Jewish. When it came to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the schools closed because no one came to school anyway. Yiddish kinder, whose parents were already not frum, but whose grandparents had been frum, whose grandparents were still living in their homes and may still have been frum. They spoke Yiddish in the house. They all made Kiddush. They all read Pesach Seder. They all told their children, if you marry a goy, I'm going to kill you. You see, Yidden became frei slowly. It was a very, very different time. There were tens of thousands of Yiddish kinder in New York City who knew Yiddish, who were not hearing about Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi, about Kometz Alapha, Gonisht. And they were all around Crown Heights. They didn't have to go any place. All these public schools that you see today had Yiddish kinderlach. So they made Mesilas Shabbos. Shabbos is no public school. And they would go to the public schools and hand out flyers and ask the kids to come to shul in the afternoon. They would give them candies and cake and soda, tell them a story, entertain them, and so on. And they drew many children. Did they draw all the tens of thousands of kids? No. They drew whomever they could. Mesilas Shabbos in the good old days was an incredibly large organization. Lubavitch in those days mobilized every single frum, boy and girl in the city of New York. Lubavitch Misnagdim, Hasidim, modern Orthodox. There was no, Lubavitch didn't have enough manpower. They went to all the yeshivas of every community and asked for the local boys and girls to make Mesilas Shabbos. Sometimes it was boys, sometimes it was girls, whoever was available. They provided them with the nash. They used to even print what was called in those days teacher's guides to give them a story and a Dvar. They gave them everything they needed to make a Mesilas Shabbos. And this all came from 770. Very few people reached untold hundreds and thousands of Yiddish through the Mesilas Shabbos. That was number one. Number two, a bigger issue, which of course is still today very much alive. Some of you participated. It's called the Release Time Program, Mitzvah. In New York, in America today, you're not allowed to teach. God forbid you should mention God in a public school, but they have an hour a week where if your parents get permission, you can take the children out of the school to a local house of worship and give them Jewish instruction. Release time today is quite big, as you all know, but in its heyday, release time numbered 10,000 children. Please, 10,000 children. Incredible numbers. And again, I don't know if you've seen this. There's a book called Shalah, which was given out by the Hecht family. They're charging $45. The only reason I didn't buy it. It's a brilliant book. Open it up and look at the pictures of the Madrichim of Shalah. A tiny percentage was Lubavitch. Tiny percentage. Every school in New York had a representative. Shalah had meetings, and Shalah was organized. Every from teenage boy and girl in New York City was recruited for the Mesilas Shabbos and for the release. Could you imagine if Lubavitch could do that today? But they push it. They used every available manpower. The vast majority of the Madrichim and Madriches that worked in those early years when they first arrived in Mesilas Shabbos and release time were not Lubavitch. But they were so happy to do it. There was somebody leading, somebody creating a direction. Unfortunately, the symptom of success is jealousy. As soon as the Lubavitch started getting more and more successful, so right away you had to criticize, and unfortunately that manpower fell away. We, I'm sure, can take some of the blame for frightening people off, but I don't think we deserve all the blame. I don't even think we deserve half the blame. After the war, the Europeans came in, and had all these holy rabbis who decided that this is not holy enough, and that's not too religious, and this is wrong. But if you take a look at that book from Shalah, your budget will fall down when you realize how the Frierdiker Rebbe made the revolution he made. He used every single boy and girl in the entire city of New York who was a Shemesh Shabbos, from the frummest to the most modern. He put them to work, sent them to a shul, gave them nash, gave them teach Yiddish kindlach about the Eibishter. And it's impossible to know how many Jewish souls were saved from those efforts, really. But it's big numbers, with very, very few people and even less money. Mesilas Shabbos and the Release Time program were the seed of the parades. The kids who were members of the Mesilas Shabbos would get together on Sunday, Lag BaOmer. From the very beginning, it was Lag BaOmer. I think that there were other occasions also when they made parades in the early years. In other words, in those days, they made parades even more than once a year. And they would march up Eastern Parkway, holding placards. Keep the Shabbos holy. All of these children's parents spoke Yiddish, went to shul, and worked on Shabbos. You didn't work on Shabbos, you starved. It wasn't complicated. To keep Shabbos in America, you had to have Pashut, Mesilas Nefesh. Not everybody had Mesilas Nefesh. And the children of the Mesilas Shabbos and the children of Eastern Parkway, those were the kids who came to these parades. And from the beginning, the parades didn't have 15 kids. They had a lot of kids. A few hundreds, then 1,000, then a few thousand, and so forth. In the early years, the parades used to take place on the side and in the back of 770. Now, you don't know where the side and the back of 770 is, because what was then the side and the back of 770 is now 770. The big shul, the gigantic shul that we all daven in, the last part of the shul, was once a driveway and a yard, and at the back of the building there were garages. It was a very, very large area. 770 was a very, very big property with substantial land on this side and substantial land on this side. You can seat a few hundred kids in that driveway, down to the bottom of the driveway and around the back. The Rebbe, the Ramash, would come and talk to the kids. What I find interesting is the Rebbe never spoke in English, always spoke in Yiddish, and he always spoke like a Rebbe. The Rebbe didn't say ever, "You're such a sweet little children. I want to tell you a story and be dramatic." The Rebbe always spoke makif, always spoke like a Rebbe, always spoke above. And someone always translated. In the very early parades, the Rebbe used to come out of his room, get on a chair. He'd come down to the yard, get up on a chair and talk to the kids. whatever time he spoke. And remember, the first years, it was during the war years, the Rebbe used to make very long talks about Yidden in America not enjoying themselves as Jews are being killed, and doing tshuva, and thinking about their brothers overseas. He would make long talks, and someone would translate, these were the parades. And of course, the story that we know from that era, which is so famous and so compelling, is the story with the Alter Rebbe. What's the Ma'aseh mit Alter Rebbe? Rabbi Yossi Goldstein tells the story that there was such a parade, and on the second floor where the Frierdiker Rebbe lived, there was a window open. Or as he liked to say, there were two windows open. And one of the windows was sitting the Frierdiker Rebbe himself in his big day Shabbos, in his streimel and his gartel, looking at the children. In the second window, there was nobody sitting. It was empty. And the entire time that the Rebbe spoke to the children, the Frierdiker Rebbe sat and listened. When the parade was over, in other words, they took the kids to the park. Obviously, the Rebbe didn't go to the park. The Rebbe was told that the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Shver, is calling him. When the Rebbe ran upstairs, and again, Rebbe Goldstein says, as he always did, 2 steps at a time, flew up the steps. As a Rein zum Rebbe, he went to Frierdiker Rebbe, and in a few minutes he came out. The Rebbe always, anything heard from Frierdiker Rebbe they could repeat, he would come downstairs and repeat it right away. The Rebbe wasn't one of those guys who got a kick out of having information you didn't have. The Rebbe was Pashta Hasidish Yid. He heard from Frierdiker Rebbe that he could repeat, he would immediately find someone and tell it to him. And he said once by Fabrengen that the Frierdiker Rebbe knew that if he tells me something, sooner or later the whole world is going to know it. So he came downstairs and he said, Ich komm jetzt für Schwer. He called the 2 organizers of the parade. You know, I once heard the story also from Rabbi Groner or the Shalom from Australia. He was one of the organizers. I'm coming from the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe Dr. Zohi. That the Alter Rebbe wrote in Siddur that on Friday night you're not supposed to say V'shamru. You don't say V'shamru. Before Shemini Esrei, you don't say V'shamru. It's printed in the Siddur, you shouldn't say it. Now why put it in the Siddur and say not to say it? You'll hear why. So the BaOmer the RaShbI asked the Alter Rebbe, why did you say in the Siddur not to say V'shamru? So the Rebbe told him, because I'll be niglitz, it's a hefsek. The psukim of V'shamru on Shabbos, and Medaber, Hashem, Medaber Meish, Medaber Yisrael on Yom Tov, it's a hefsek, not say it. So the BaOmer the RaShbI said to the Alter Rebbe, but when you say V'shamru on Friday night before Shemini Esrei, Verta ganze Yidid l'mayla. It creates a whole market in heaven. So the Rebbe told the BaOmer the RaShbI, nicht auf jeden Yerid darf man gehen. You don't have to go to every market. So what the Alter Rebbe did was he put the V'shamru in the Siddur in honor of his Mechutin and wrote not to say it because he held it up to Allah for hefsek. So the Frierdiker Rebbe tells this all to the Rebbe that the Alter Rebbe told the BaOmer the RaShbI, nicht auf jeden Yerid darf man gehen, and then the Frierdiker Rebbe adds, of dem Yerid is the Alter Rebbe sicher gewesen. By this market, these couple of hundred Yiddish kinderach in the courtyard of 770 in 1942, whatever it was, the Alter Rebbe was certainly present. You understand? That's how holy and how serious and how sacred this was. I'm sorry. Yeah, there are pictures. They gave out books. They give out pamphlets. Lubavitch used to be a pretty organized organization. That all ended in a cold winter day in Shvat in 1950. But the Chai and Frierdiker Rebbe, they used to give out pamphlets. I remember as a child, my father used to have these little booklets that pictures of these parades that they had in the early 40s, 42, 43, mamish as soon as the Rebbe arrived. When the Rebbe became Rebbe, the work of the parade became, in effect, other people's business. The Rebbe participated in the parade, or the Rebbe was not involved in the nuts and bolts of the parades as he had been involved before. I mean, you have to understand, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Rebbe every week would look over the release time brochures, what the people were going to learn, and he made sure that every single boy and girl went on release time, mitvach show. The story is, the Rebbe once walked into this Medrash on Wednesday. There was one bacha sitting and learning, and the Rebbe told him, "What are you doing here? It's Wednesday." There was no such market business. The Rebbe made sure he wasn't at the Rebbe. Every bacha, everybody who possibly could. Mitvach show was hatzavas nefashos mamish, and it's today, by the way. The release time with those rotten, obnoxious, spoiled, impossible to satisfy children is you're saving kids from shmad. If one of those kids doesn't marry a goy because of you, think what that means. It's very difficult. It's not very rewarding. The kids in 1940 were a lot better behaved than in 2014. I give you my word. But you have to understand what you're talking about. This is the trenches. This is the front lines. These kids have no Yiddishkeit except this. And the Rebbe was directly involved. When the Rebbe became a Rebbe, by the way, the Rebbe, the person who did the release time was Rabbi Hecht, Yankel Hecht, J.J. Hecht, the story goes that the Rebbe had, the Frierdiker Rebbe had two very capable young light. One of them was Rabbi Hecht, the other one I don't know who he was. And the Frierdiker Rebbe gave one of them to the RaShbI and the other one to the Rebbe. He gave J.J. Hecht to the RaShbI. J.J. Hecht and the RaShbI didn't get along so well. The Rebbe and the person the Rebbe gave him, so the Rebbe went into the Frierdiker Rebbe and said, can we swap? Would it be okay if we change? And the RaShbI agreed, and Yankel Hecht, the Rebbe Poshet asked to work with him. Yankel Hecht was an American boy who was a very energetic fellow. And he was in his way quite modern. When Yankel Hecht got married, he was clean shaven, he didn't have a beard. He was clean shaven. All the Hechts were clean shaven. The beard came later. But they were Chassidish Yidden, and he worked with the Rebbe hand in hand, and he did a million things. I mean, it's impossible to appreciate what Hecht did, but the essence of his organization is called Shalosh Yuri Limudei Adas, which is the release time program, Mitzvah Shah, which is now having a resurgence in the last 10 years or so. And he kept this going, and they make parades. The parades were always on Sunday for the obvious reason. The parades were made, they targeted the public school kids. They did everything in their power to get as many of the public school kids who were members of the release time to come to the parades. Even now, you'll probably have Sunday 1,000 kids by the parade, which is a very big number. So it's not enough, but it's a very significant number. The parades were to get these public school kids to show up, march, be proud. But the parades were held only on Sunday. So I made a list of parade occasions. But let me tell you two more stories. Okay? Two more stories that I'll get to the actual dates, years. The first one is an old story. I should have told it to you before. I forgot to tell it to you. Two bochim in Montreal yeshiva are going on Mivtzoyim on Friday, and they walk into the office of a successful businessman, and they ask him if he's Jewish. He'd like to put on film. He says he's Jewish. He doesn't want to put on film, and I don't want you to ever come back here again. But before I kick you out, I want to tell you something. And he tells them the following. He grew up in Montreal in the 30s and 40s. In those days, this was true, by the way, in New York also. If you were Jewish, you didn't want your neighbors to know. You never walked in the street with a yarmulke. Never. You always wore a hat or a cap. You never put your tzitzis out because of anti-Semitism. You just wanted to melt into the background. You never wanted to be identified as a Jew. This was the culture. The established Jewish philosophy was, don't get seen. Be in the background. Then 9 boys came from Poland to Montreal in 1941. The first boys who came from through the east, through Japan, through China, through San Francisco, they came to Montreal. They had visas. The Canadian government gave 9 visas. And they opened the yeshivas Temchet. These were the best of Lubavitch. Who were the names? Rabbi Greenglass, Olav Shalom, Rabbi Galitsky, Olav Shalom, Rabbi Kramer, Rabbi Weinberg, Rabbi Tenenbaum. And so they couldn't come into America for many years. They had their visas to come to Canada. They made a yeshiva and they immediately started doing the same thing here in New York. Masiba Shabbos, Mitzvah Shah, parades. Almost as soon as they arrived. They were very Hasidic Bachrim, but they went to work and they did what they had to do. So this Canadian says to this Lubavitcher boy, he says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe made people proud to be Jewish. I was a little boy, and I marched to those parades, he says. And you can't imagine the effect that the parade had on us. Here we were people who just wanted to disappear, to not exist. And along comes a rabbi and says, what not exist? Not only do we exist, we're going to let everybody know who we are. We're very proud. We're going to dare them to defy us. He says he made Jewish people proud. He says, now get out of my office. He says, I heard it from somebody, I heard it from one of the Bachrim. This man is now close to 80 in Istanbul when he told over the story. But this was an event from his childhood which was to him very, very important. Now another story, which has been denied, but it's true. There's a Yid who passed away young, unfortunately, it was Rabbi Elio Engel. And he came to Fabrengen once in yeshiva. And he started the Fabrengen by saying, the problem with all you Bochum is that you never learned to misnagdish yeshivas. That's how we Shalom Aleichem does. You learn to misnagdish yeshiva, you learn what Chassidus is, what Lubavitch is, and so on. Anyway, It's a long story, but the story that he told us, amongst many stories, was that it was Tafshin Yud Zayin, 1957, or 56. There was a parade in New York. There was also a parade in Montreal. You know, it may have been Tafshin Chof, I don't know what year it was. And everyone's getting ready for the parade. He was learning in 770 at the time. The Rebbe goes out of his room, goes across the office to the mosquitoes to pick up the mail. The Rebbe went himself to get the mail. In those years especially, the Rebbe walked very fast. Went across the hall, got the mail, went back to his room. He picked up the mail, walked out of the mosquitoes back to his room, and as he's walking from the mosquitoes to his office, how many steps is it? It's 12 feet, 15 feet, it's a small little hallway. The Rebbe manages to open a letter, read it finished end, rip it up into pieces, and throw it in the garbage in the hallway and go into his room. Now, what do you think the Lubavitcher Rebbe was thinking? The Rebbe is a man of incredible discretion, and the Rebbe knew very well that if he tears up a paper, puts it in the garbage in the hallway, before the papers land on the plastic side of the garbage can, the Bochum are going to rip it out. They're going to put it. It's like the Bochum went into the garbage can and they took it out and they put it together like a jigsaw puzzle. A friend of mine asked the Bochum, who was accused of actually putting it back together, and he categorically denied it, but I don't believe his denial. And it was a letter from Rabbi Greenlass to the Rebbe, where he wrote to the Rebbe that the Bochum are busy with the parade and they're not keeping Seder. He objected. This is the letter the Rebbe tore up and put into a garbage can that was public. There is that the Bochum are not keeping Seder because they're busy working the parade. The Rebbe knew very well that Rabbi Greenlass was going to hear about this. When Rabbi Greenlass was an old man, he would come to the place where the Bochum were working on the parade and ask to paint. He wanted to push it. Be mishtatef begufer. He wanted to physically work in preparation for the parade. That's how sensitized he became over the course of his lifetime to the Rebbe's revolution. Understand? Now, there was a parade in 1953, in 1956. 1957 was the first time they made the parade in front of 770, with the platform going up and the sign on top of the Rebbe. You see pictures of the Rebbe talking to the children. 1960 there was a parade. There's a lot of very beautiful pictures of the Rebbe from 1960. 1960 the slogan was Shas HaMasayim from the Baal Shem Tov. 63 was a parade. 66 Tafshin Chavav was a parade. 67 Tafshin Chazayim was a parade. 1970 Tafshin Lamed. 1973 Tafshin Lamed Gimel. Now, Tafshin Lamed Vav was a Chiddush. It was on Tuesday. The Rebbe didn't make parades on Tuesday because the public school children, the Pashtus, could not come. They made an exception. He made a parade. The Rebbe was called Shas HaChinuch. And for those who are not aware, they just now, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, quote, found, end quote, the Sikha of the parade from 38 years ago, Tafshin Lamed Vav, completely edited by the Rebbe start to finish. Nobody even knew it existed. So if I may use simple, plain English, the Rebbe sent us a gift for the parade of Tafshin Ayin Daled, a completely edited Sikha, which Kvayocha was done 38 years ago, and for reasons that the Rebbe knows, he kept that Sikha for today. It's really exciting when these kinds of things happen, because this is not accidents, this is not by mistake. The Rebbe is Poshet gesagt, here's a gift. And I think when the Rebbe sends such a gift, it usually means a smiley. For this parade, the Rebbe sent us a Sikha from 38 years ago. It's the second 6 of the 12 psukim. I hope with my seminary, one girl still get around to the 12 psukim before the year runs out. We're having a hard time getting through things. Tafshin Mem, 1980 was a big parade. Tafshin Mem Gimel, 83, 84, 87. Tafshin Nun was so far the last time that I participated in a parade. There's been many parades since, and now it's getting again bigger and bigger. And it's impossible to imagine the kind of nachas ruach the Rebbe gets from the parade. To participate in the parade is a big thing. To be at the parade itself. The Rebbe will be Sunday at 10 o'clock in the morning in front of 770. Unless you're busy parading someplace else, in which case the Rebbe is going to walk next to you. Be there. Now, I have no time, and I have so much to say about individual parades. So let me just mention 2. 1967 was literally a week before the 6-Day War. This is Yud Chas Iyar. The 6-Day War started like Beis Sivan, right? The world was in a panic. The Jews were expecting Poshet a Holocaust. The governments instructed all of their nationals to leave Eretz Yisrael, to leave the Middle East in anticipation of the war. And the Rebbe said nobody moves. Eretz Yisrael is safe, the Eibishter is watching it, and so forth and so on. Everybody should say, there's a lot of stories about this. By the parade, you could see the video and the audio, it's so powerful. In those years, the Rebbe didn't speak long sichos. When I remember the parades, the Rebbe could talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours. But in those years, the Rebbe spoke quite short. The Rebbe said, there's another thing I want to talk about. And he said, Rebbe, you have to see the footage. It's just incredible. Brider und Schwester in Eretz Yisrael and Eretz HaKodesh. Your brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, the Holy Land, find themselves in a difficult situation from which they will certainly emerge ba'atzlocha. And the Rebbe spoke 2-3 minutes. And the toichin was that every child here in America who will learn with a pasuk chumash more, and say a kapitel tilim more, will help protect Yidden Yisrael. The Rebbe spoke with such confidence, with such zichigkeit. Every newspaper in Eretz Yisrael reported the go'oin, the gaiva, the betachim that the Rebbe spoke then, and in all the telegrams that was written over the course of the time. The Rebbe was the only person who predicted the unbelievable hatzlacha of the 6-Day War. Many people have said that it's the 6-Day War that made the Rebbe, not the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but the Rebbe, not Harabi, but Lubavitch, Harabi. One other prayer I want to mention was Tafshin Mem 1980. I wasn't here actually, but somehow I've convinced myself I was. I imagined myself being here, but I wasn't. It was incredibly hot. Indescribably hot. There were more kids at that parade than any parade before and maybe even after. We had, Baruch Hashem, Misnagdish friends in no shortage. The Getter Rebbe instructed every Getter yeshiva in the world to bring every single Getter child to the parades, to be Solidarity with Lubavitch against you know who from you know where. It was an unbelievable Kiddush Hashem. And a lot of other Hasidic groups joined. It was packed.
Other groups are making other
From all over, from Williams, from not from Williamsburg, from Borough Park, they came buses and buses. Every single Getter child was at that parade. It was a very big Kiddush Hashem, very big Kiddush Hashem. And it was incredibly hot. The Rebbe spoke one sicha, the Rebbe spoke a second sicha, Yehecht translated, and after the second sicha, Yankel Hecht says on the microphone, you can hear him say it. Kinderlach, just a few more minutes. The Rebbe knows how hot it is. And the Rebbe knows how uncomfortable you are. And he's like a daddy to you. He would never want you to be uncomfortable. We're going to be able to march in a few minutes. And then the Rebbe spoke for 45 minutes in Russian. In Russian. Somebody told me now that if you watch the film, where they're talking in Russian, behind the Rebbe is the Rashagi. You see that the Rashagi is running around like a nervous. It was an incredible thing. The Rebbe was so careful. The Rebbe's philosophy towards Russia was do not antagonize. Do not antagonize the government of Russia. The government of Russia knows that Lubavitch is not interested in hurting them. And Lubavitch always took a position. We were against demonstrations in Russia, out of Russia. Lubavitch is now being rewarded by the Russian government for how Lubavitch dealt with the Soviets. Lubavitch never ever did things to hurt the government. It was always about Yiddishkeit. The Rebbe never should. On the street, with television stations, and the Russians certainly had people there, 45 minutes. And the whole toichin of the sicha was that people should know that according to Russian law, you're allowed to learn Torah with your children, and you're allowed to gather in groups of 4 and 5. They articulated the same things the Friedrich Rebbe used to say 70 years before. And the kids were melting. The one piece of good news was Rabbi Hecht didn't understand the Russian. So it didn't get translated. It would have been another 45 minutes. That sicha marked a turning point in Russia push. That sicha was not only a sicha heard in Brooklyn or in Moscow. That sicha was heard Lamayla. The beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, if you study Lubavitch history, is this parade. Okay, I'll see you, Mitzvah Hashem. Good night, everybody.